as Simon said, I'm going to talk probably for about 20 minutes, covering a variety of topics based around a particular family and some of the issues that they have, looking at some relevant history, some international law, and some of the Israeli and Palestinian peace groups. And also, as Simon mentioned, explain to you more about the role of EAPPI, the Ecumenical Accompaniment Programme in Palestine and Israel. I think I'll stick to EAPPI in future. So I was there at the beginning of the year, which was a particularly turbulent time, because not only was the ongoing occupation there, but it was also when Trump was announcing his deal of the century, and also it was at the onset of coronavirus. So now I'm going to attempt to share my screen, which hopefully I have the rights for. Okay. So as I said, or maybe I didn't, I was based in East Jerusalem at the beginning of the year. And here is a map I suspect most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with. And here is Jerusalem, just on the little indent of this green kidney, which shows the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and the Golan Heights. And just to give you a better idea, to put it into context, this blue shape here is exactly the same size as the green kidney, but the little indent that was Jerusalem is now where Watford is. So Palestine is home to over 5 million people. 1.8 million of them live here in the Gaza Strip. The particular family I'm going to talk about to illustrate some of the points and issues that Palestinians encounter on a day-to-day basis is the Garib family. And here they are, they live at Beit Jitza. And this is Sahet, the father. He's 38 years old, and he lives in his house with his mother, his wife, and his 3 children. The house they live in was built by Saet's father back in 1978 on an area of about 100 dunams, which is approximately 25 acres. There are some issues for the Garib family though, and that's the location, the extent of their property, the access to the property, and the relationship that they have with their settler neighbours. So looking at the location, this is an interactive map from B'Tselem, which is an Israeli peace organisation, which shows a lot of things, including actually I want to point out the green line, which goes around here, around East Jerusalem, and up to the corner of the West Bank. And this red line here is a separation barrier. You can see how it twists and turns. And here is Beit Jitza. I'm just circling it here with my little mouse. And you can see it again kind of highlighted over here. But your photos are in my way, I'll have to switch that off. So in the blue area that you can see here, these are all settlements that are all in the West Bank and built illegally. So here close up, you can see Beit Jitza again, and you can see how this red line of the separation barrier cuts straight across it. So just to make sure that everybody knows what I'm talking about, there's a bit of jargon buster. The separation barrier, it's also known as the wall or the fence because it takes on different forms in different parts of the West Bank. This map again here is just to give you an idea of how it weaves around the outside so you can see it as a whole. I'm sorry about the size of it, it's probably a bit small to appreciate. So other terms that I'm going to be using, a settler. A settler is an Israeli living on Palestinian land. And a settlement is a civilian community inhabited by Israelis built on land occupied by Israel during the 1967 war. Occupation. This is an effective control by a certain ruling power over a territory which is not under their formal sovereignty. Annexation, which is a bit of a key term at the moment, is an acquisition of territory through the threat or use of force, whether realised in practice and in fact, which is de facto, or through formal extension of authority by law, de jure, but both are strictly prohibited under international law. Article 2 of the UN Charter. Now, another map I'd like to show you here illustrates the Israeli settlements in the West Bank. This yellow colour is an area that's inaccessible or restricted to Palestinians. And you can see this interlacing of the yellow roads, which are all settler-only roads that join up all the different settlements. Some figures here about 1967, the Six-Day War. Actually, it says the 60-day war there, but it should be 6. And as you can see, as of 2019, there are approximately 132 settlements in the West Bank now, according to Peace Now, with an estimated 650,000 Israeli settlers living there. There are also 113 outposts, which are built without official authorization from the government, but it's all been done with political, military, and financial support of the government. So why do people want to live in a settlement? The majority of settlers are seeking a better quality of life, and they move to the West Bank because of its advantages compared to being in Israel. Housing in many settlements is subsidised by the Israeli government, and there's preferential mortgage rates and subsidised utilities. Education, many schools receive higher levels of funding than in Israel. And the business, its income breaks given for unregulated labour practices too, so it all looks fairly favourable. So heading back to Beit Jitza. So you can see again a bit closer here, the separation barrier just cutting through the village, and this blue area again, the settlement of Jivon HaHadasha. And right on the edge here, this is where the Garib family live. This is an aerial view of the settlement. This yellow line here shows the outline of the settlement. And here, within this little enclave, is the Garib's house. This gives you a better view of the extent of their property. You can see how it's all but surrounded by the settlement. There have been 7 demolition orders on their house since the settlement was built, which have all been counted because they do have the correct legal papers to be living there. In this area here, where you can see the cars are parked, this is the parking area for the settlement. In 2013, there was a court ruling that said this land belonged to the Garibs. However, the car park is still there. Their access to the remaining agricultural land that they own is through a gate some distance away, and this gate is only open on a handful of days each year. This here is the entrance to the driveway leading up to their house. Underneath this access here, there's a sunken military road, and these gates here are under military control. Back in 2008, they were closed for 3 months. And if the Garibs wanted to leave or return to their property, they had to contact either the military or the Red Cross to get their gates opened. These photos taken here, this one here is just on the inside of this gate so that the soldiers can access the Garibs' property from the sunken military road. And this gate here gives access to the settlement. So if the soldiers have left this gate open, then the settlers can access the Garibs' property. This happened, and it's happened on a couple of occasions, and on one time in particular, there were over 100 settlers that came into the Garibs' land in broad daylight, carrying guns when the children were out in the garden. So the relationship they have with the neighbouring settlers isn't easy. They're very close to begin with, they're only 3 metres away. However, if they were to drive to each other's houses, it would take at least a 1.5 hour drive because of the checkpoints that they have to go through. And incidentally, these checkpoints pre-corona were crossed by 65,000 Palestinians every day to enter Jerusalem. Back to the Garibs, they're not allowed to plant anything right on the edge, no trees. And they haven't been allowed to repair their house. They had a damaged water tank. The Israeli authorities said they couldn't repair it. Basically, they just want them to leave. Back in 1979, the settlers offered Saad's father a lot of money for the land, but he refused and said, even if you gave me all of Israel's money, I would never concede 1 inch of my land. So I took this view standing right beside the Garib's house, so you can see how very much overlooked they are. So to try and put this in perspective, I'm going to give you a tiny snapshot of historical events. And you could probably study the historical events for years and not know exactly what had happened. So just very briefly, I expect you're aware of the Balfour Declaration, which was a letter sent to Lord Rothschild, the leader of the British Jewish Federation, from the Foreign Secretary, Balfour, for Lord Balfour to transmit this information to the Zionist Federation of Great Britain and Ireland. So in it, he said, His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing should be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. So back in 1947 and 1948, the UN proposed partition into the 2 separate states, but this didn't happen. Instead, the state of Israel was unilaterally declared, which led to the Arab-Israeli War and the Nakba, the catastrophe with the displacement of 750,000 Palestinians in 1948. So in 1949, the Green Line was drawn up, which was the de facto border between the new state of Israel and its Arab neighbours. In 1967, there was a 6-day war, Israel versus Syria, Egypt and Jordan, which led to the occupation of the West Bank, Sinai, including Gaza Strip and the Golan Heights. And since then, 650,000 Israelis have moved onto the occupied Palestinian area in contravention of international law. So also now some facts about the separation barrier. This information has come from B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Centre for Human Rights in Occupied Palestine. So the planned length of the separation barrier is 709 kilometres, twice the length of the Green Line. And 85% of this barrier falls inside the Green Line. Whilst the building of the wall stroke the barrier is not illegal, where it has been constructed on Palestinian land, this does contravene humanitarian law. So in urban areas, which is a total of 70 kilometres, the barrier is constructed with 8 to 9 metre high concrete slabs, and in rural areas, it's on average 60 metres wide. Since 1967, as we saw on the slide before, 250 Israeli settlements and outposts have been established in the West Bank, including in East Jerusalem. So here's an example of the wall. We went to the bank at Al Ram, and where we're standing, we're looking directly at this wall here, which is the 8 to 9 metre high concrete slabs, which is built all the way alongside the high street. After we visited the Garibs, we went to a neighbouring village called Kalandia, and we spoke to the mayor there, Rafat Awadallah. The wall was built in Kalandia in 2006, and when it was built, Rafat's journey to work changed from a 2-minute walk to a 1 to 3 hour car journey, depending on what the traffic and the checkpoints were like. The wall was also built between his house and his brother's house. He talked about how when the wall was built originally, it had these gaps in it, these holes in it, where people used to pass things through. But these were eventually filled up. However, oddly enough, with the onset of coronavirus, there have been spaces made in the wall and the barrier, because it's more in the Israelis' interest for the Palestinians to come through during the lockdown to work. And it's the Palestinian authorities who've been trying to stop this from happening. So with this situation, there are 3 areas of relevant international humanitarian law. So the laws which the route of the barrier and the building of the settlement contravenes. So firstly, the Geneva Convention. Well, what is the Geneva Convention? These are rules that apply only in times of armed conflict and seek to protect people who are not or are no longer taking part in hostilities, including the sick and the wounded, or armed forces on the field, sick and shipwrecked members of armed forces at sea, prisoners of war, and civilians. And it says the occupying power shall not deport or transfer parts of its own civilian population to the territory it occupies. The International Court of Justice advised in July 2005 that the construction of the wall being built by Israel and its associated regime are contrary to international law, and if it were to become permanent, become tantamount to de facto annexation. The UN Security Council Resolution 2334 in 2016, which is one of about 25 regarding the occupation, it states that Israel's settlement activity constitutes a flagrant violation of international law and has no legal validity. It demands that Israel stop such activity and fulfill its obligations as an occupying power under the Fourth Geneva Convention. So I said I was going to explain a little bit more about EAPPI. Well, the vision of EAPPI is to have a future where the occupation ended with both Palestinians and Israelis enjoying a just peace with freedom based on international law. It came about back in 2002 when the churches in Jerusalem got together because they were concerned about what was happening and that the fact that there were no external observers on the ground. So they went to the World Council of Churches and asked whether or not something could be put in place. I was sent into the field by Quaker Peace and Social Witness, but there are 25 other countries involved in EAPPI, and it's still coordinated by the World Council of Churches. It practices an internationally recognised accompaniment model used in conflict zones, where a protective presence is required on the ground. So you're walking alongside the affected community to help alleviate or reduce their suffering. To be fully effective, this should be strategically combined with advocacy to raise awareness internationally and to increase pressure on the perpetrators of human rights abuses to end the violations of international law and ultimately bring an end to the occupation. So the work that I was involved with was the proactive presence, solidarity, monitoring of access to education, monitoring of access to worship and access to work, looking at checkpoints, working with other NGOs and recording data on the United Nations Office for Humanitarians database and attending demolitions. What's very important about EAPPI is its practice of principled impartiality. And this means that they don't take sides for either the Palestinians or the Israelis, but they stand on the side of justice and human rights. So they put concern for human rights above support for any particular group, using international law as a principle for our impartiality, keeping any desire to support one side over another in check, because the principles of human rights are more important. And finally, that the policies of the Israeli government are the problem. EAPPI is not challenging Israel's right to exist. So here we are doing some protective presence at a Bedouin community called Khan al-Akmar. It's just to the north of Jerusalem and it's in a very key area. It's been under a lot of pressure probably over the last 20 years, and back in 2018 there was a permanent presence by EAPPI. They were camping out for a couple of months because there was a very big threat at the time of the bulldozers coming in. And the threat kind of comes and goes depending on what's happening in politics. I think it's probably ramping up again. But while I was there, we would make weekly visits to talk to the community and to find out what was happening. Here we are attending a demolition at Beit Hanina. This was a workshop and people had just come along and taken it to people. So people, the Israeli army or the IDF had just taken it to pieces. I don't think there'd been very much notice. And we went to talk to the owner and to find out if there's anything we could do, because we're trying to bridge the gap for them as well. If we can put them in touch with any other NGOs that can help and support them, that's part of our work, and to make sure that it gets reported on the database. While I was there, I think I attended about 11 demolitions. And this is the group I was with. And in the middle is Firas. He was our driver when we needed a driver. And he was also a translator, which was fantastic. And he's worked for EAPPI for 10 years. So he was the continuity, really. He knew what was happening on the ground. He had a lot of contacts, and he certainly, made the job a lot easier, and probably, helped an awful lot the Palestinians too. So I was with, this is Kristen from Norway, Lena from Sweden, and Anna from Finland. And these two particularly were both very fit and active. Some days we were walking 10 miles up and down very steep hills, so it kept us on our toes. So what's the Israeli rationale? How do they square all these things? So in May 2015, on the IDF website, set in the back straight wrote, the security fence serves one purpose and one purpose only, to prevent terrorists from carrying out deadly attacks on Israeli civilians. And since the wall has been built, the Palestinian terror has significantly declined. And on settlements, in response to the existence of settlements, the Israeli government holds the position that the land is disputed as opposed to occupied. However, not all Israelis concur with these views, and the international community does see it as an occupation. So I mentioned at the beginning again that we spoke and worked with a lot of Israeli and Palestinian peace groups and activists. And here you can see a picture of one of the ladies called the Women in Black. This was a group that originated in Israel back in January 1988 in response to the first Intifada. So she's got Stop or End the Occupation written in 3 different languages here. And they've stood in the same place in Paris Square in Jerusalem since 1988, every Friday from 12 o'clock to 1 o'clock. It's a very brave group because they're subjected to quite a lot of unpleasantness from the passing Israeli public, who just shout at them and call them traitors. One afternoon when I was there, somebody rode past on a motorbike and just snatched one of those wooden hands out and started smashing on the head of one of the protesters, and then rode off again. There's another group called Maxim Watch. They're also a group of women, actually, an Israeli group, and they set themselves up in 2001 to observe and report on the occupation, monitoring the West Bank checkpoints, the separation fence, the agricultural gates, and the military courts. They document and report to try and influence opinion in Israel and attempt to ease the frustrations and hardships of Palestinians. And then another group we worked with was the Parents Circle. They came to speak to us, and it was very moving. So to be a member of the Parents Circle, you have to have lost a relation. And they always send somebody from Israel and somebody from Palestine. So this is Aisha from Nablus, who lost her brother, and Ruth from Jerusalem, who lost her son. They spoke very movingly about how they try and work together and, yes, change things, make people realise that it's a no-win situation and that, nothing's going to be solved until they reach a peace and just end. In fact, it was the beginning of my awareness is when I met somebody at the Parents Circle back at Godalming Meeting House, I think about 10 years ago, where I felt sufficiently moved to start beginning to look into what was happening in Palestine and Israel a lot more closely. And this year, well, every year actually, they've had a joint Israeli-Palestinian ceremony, which they hold on the Israeli Memorial Day And back in 2019, they had a turnout of 10,000 people live in Tel Aviv. Obviously, this year they couldn't have a live ceremony, but they went online. And on the 28th of April, the Times of Israel reported that nearly 200,000 people watched this online event. So what's the current situation? Médecins Sans Frontières gave a project update in April, which unfortunately indicated that attacks by Israeli settlers against the Palestinians were rising. And I think this has probably continued because it's very hard without any international observers there. And as I mentioned too, the deal of the century, the coalition government and annexation. The threatened annexation on the 1st of July didn't happen, but it's still hovering in the background. And internationals need to continue putting pressure on to try and reverse all of this. There was another lockdown in the West Bank at the beginning of July. And the second lockdown in Israel is only just coming to an end. That was at the middle of October. And without a doubt, the lockdowns in Israel obviously affect Palestine too, because they can't travel in and out, they can't do their work, they can't earn any money. There's no furlough system there. And obviously what was been a very hard time has been made 10 times harder. So back to the Garrett family. Said was interviewed by the Middle East Monitor in April, and he told them that if my house was demolished, I would live in a tent. I will never leave my family's house to the settlers. This example of peaceful resistance should be a call to action for all of us. Palestinians aren't giving up, and nor should we. We should continue to work towards the end of the occupation and a just peace for Palestinians and Israelis based on international law. So what can we do? You can write to your elected representatives, ask them to speak out publicly against the Israeli government's annexation plans, ask them to write on their own behalf to the Foreign Secretary, urge them to provide funding and practical humanitarian support to communities who are facing the twin threats of military occupation and the coronavirus pandemic. Keep up to date. There's so much information online now. I can give you a whole list of websites which you might find interesting. And obviously visit when possible. And there's also one which I particularly like is the twinning. There's a Britain-Palestine Friendship and Twinning Network where you can support people in Palestine through this. But there are many others, and I can again give you more information about how you can help and support. Thank you. Thanks. I hope I didn't speak too fast. I do have a bad tendency, and I didn't say that at the beginning. I should have got someone to have a buzzer to say slow down.
Thank you, Sue. That was a really interesting summary of the background, as well as of your personal experience as an accompanier. There was a question I wanted to ask, and I think I've forgotten what it was now. So I'll invite. It was based on your last slide, and I was distracted by my echo.
What to do?
Yeah. Well. Oh, yes. What to do? Yes. Well, I think some people probably know that we have had a twinning group in Watford Friends of Southfleet, which is a community in the West Bank. And that is now actually, it's slightly changed its purpose in that it's become more closely associated with Palestine solidarity, because it was having its bank accounts closed and things because of its association with Palestine anyway. So it decided it might as well be more overtly political. I haven't been directly involved in it for a little while. I don't know if anybody else here has, but I think that the twinning idea and trying to be do it from a neutral point of view, or this particular group was set up as purely to sort of support educational and development projects in Palestinian communities. But nevertheless, it fell foul when the co-op, it had its bank account with the co-op, and the co-op was taken over by, the co-op bank was taken over by an American hedge fund or something, or part of the conglomerate was an American hedge fund who decided that they didn't want to, they weren't going to allow the co-op bank to provide banking facilities to anybody who supported seen as supporting Palestinians. And I wonder whether well, okay, so I'm rambling on a bit. In terms of how we can support the EAPPI program, it actually, presumably it needs funds itself directly. We can.
What you can do, I can put that on an email. It's a very long list of about 15 or 20 different options of different ways that you can support, but to have gone through them one by one, I thought was a bit much. But I can send that on as an email, and you could circulate that if people are interested. Okay, and funding is one of the things.
Great. Okay. Sorry, I don't want to. Has anyone else got any questions or comments? Christine.
A few years ago, we went to a talk at a friend's house, and as I understood it, that accompaniers, when they were going to go on the job, they had to pretend that that's not what they were not there for, or they would not have been allowed in. Did you have trouble actually getting in to do the job?
Well, we're told we do have a kind of bit of airport information training, but we're told never to lie. You know, we are there on a church program. We're there for the World Council of Churches. But, you know, it is known that people do get turned away. Other countries do it in different ways, actually. Sometimes, I think one of the international countries, they let their ecumenical accompaniers buy a return ticket for 2 weeks from the time that they arrive, and then they cancel it. But that's not the way the UK does it.
Chris?
Yeah, Watford Friends of Salfete was very strong 10, 12 years ago. And I think it really closed because interest just dwindled. People got fed up with it. They got tired. Nothing was happening. There was no progress being made. Now, how can we get out of that vicious circle?
I think that is it. Is that, you know, the fact that it's 53 years gone by and not much seems to have changed. But maybe we've been helped a bit by some of the things that have been going on in the news with the normalisation of the UAE and Bahrain. You know, maybe that will bring the Palestinians a bit closer together. But the EAPPI itself, they're doing an initiative because they've got nobody on the ground at the moment. They're doing an olive initiative. And I will send out a link to the World Council of Churches where you can get kind of weekly updates of what's happening for the olive picking this year, because that's very important to Palestinians. You know, that's basically the root of their community and everything. So they're just trying to regenerate more interest, build things up. And really the only way you can keep going is to keep talking about it and keep trying to engage other people and seeing what's going on. And there is a lot of things happening out there. And there is still a will. Yes, but whether there's a way.
When I was involved with Watford Friends of Salfete, I went with another member to meet with our local MP, who ironically subsequently became the Justice Secretary, and after that became a Tory rebel and lost his seat at the last election to an official Tory, a man called David Gauke. His sort of continued line in response to challenges about government policy in relation to Israel-Palestine was, well, you do realise, don't you, that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, and therefore we have to support them against all the, you know, as a bastion of freedom and democracy in an area of you know, Islamic dictatorships and so on. This was probably 5 or 6 years ago, and I find that's quite well. It's a very common response, you know, that people say, well, they're like us, you know, we whatever they do, they're doing it in defending our sort of culture and our way of life against the sort of the more alien. It isn't necessarily explained in those terms, but this is an argument or an attitude of mind, perhaps, that affects the lack of interest in the Palestinian cause. How do you address that if you come across it, Sue, when you're talking about your work?
I think you can go at it sideways. I mean, you can also chip away at different things. Like, I don't know if anybody's aware of what JCB have been doing recently, and that's a growing crowd of people who obviously don't like that, because JCB is one of 3 British companies that the United Nations have named as profiting from the occupation. And if you feel you can't do the really big things, then just start chipping away at the smaller ones.
So would you? I mean, I've seen that in relation to the NSPCC accepting, funding from
That's right,
from
yeah.
JCB and being asked to either pressurize JCB or refuse to accept their financial support. Yeah.
But without the donations even to the NSPCC, why JCB profiting in Israel?
Jocelyn, did you have your hand?
I just had a more personal question, Sue.
Sure.
Your translator that you said had been with the group for many years, is he Palestinian or is he Israeli?
Yes. No, he's Palestinian, Firas.
He's Palestinian. I just wonder how people react to him, and if there would be any chance of getting a Jewish person to also be involved in some way on the ground like that.
In terms of where Firas was most useful, it was taking us to places in Palestine, really.
Yes.
So, a Jewish person, I mean, I'm sure there would have been, I mean, there are other peace groups, there's plenty of Jewish peace groups or Israeli peace groups, who do things within Palestine too. But for EAPPI, I think, it was very handy to have somebody who was Palestinian, because he could relate to the people and, translate for us. And obviously they would probably be more likely to get in touch with him and tell him what was happening. So for feedback and information, and they obviously would have been able to, he would have been able to empathize with them more, perhaps.
I feel as if the parents' circle, I've heard those ladies speaking, and I feel as if that's actually the way to get information to a lot of people, a lot of ordinary people that wouldn't normally be interested in the political scene.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think they are really, fantastic. As I say, that's what attracted me first, how I got interested. It wasn't necessarily the political bit, it was the fact that there's just all this, needless killing going on.
Go on, Ian. Yeah.
My question is this, Sue, I don't think you mentioned the Gaza Strip at all. And
I didn't go to the Gaza Strip.
Can I just put the question? There was a time, and I can't remember when, was it 10 years ago, when the Israeli troops simply moved totally out of the Gaza Strip.
That's right.
And that was regarded, by me at least, as a rather positive thing to do, but it didn't seem to have any positive effects.
Well, they moved out of the Gaza Strip, but then they put a blockade all around it. So nothing could go in and out of the Gaza Strip.
Well, the things that come out of the Gaza Strip tend to be rockets.
Well, they do indeed, but as I say, that they can't get in or out. Unfortunately, most of the people in the Gaza Strip.
They have built tunnels, so I'm just not wishing.
Yes. Yeah, no, the Gaza Strip isn't really an area that I know anything about, I'm afraid. I can't pretend to.
My second question is, do the Palestine leaders recognize the possibility of a dual state solution, which seems to be the only one that I can think of which has any hope of success?
I'm not sure that I can answer for the Palestinian leaders, I'm afraid, either.
Okay.
I think the Palestinian leadership, in terms of the election of Hamas in the Gaza Strip in particular, have become, they've become more intransigent in response to the intransigence of the situation. I think to a large extent, Hamas is a creation of occupation and the conditions in Gaza. I mean, I'm not claiming to be an expert. I know that much about Gaza myself either, but the vast majority, almost hardly any of the people who live in Gaza are actually from Gaza. The vast majority of them are refugees from other parts of. Go on, Chris.
It's a Palestinian doctor who was born in a refugee camp in Gaza, and it's a brilliant book to read. It's not that well written, but what it tells you about life in Gaza is just incredible. And he worked mainly in Israeli hospitals, but he ended up by going to Canada, and he couldn't do it anymore about 10 years ago.
Thank you.
Jonathan.
Thanks. Can I ask you a question about your own personal experience of being an impartial monitor? Are there any things that you could tell us about that you experienced and observed of human rights conflicts or if you were there as a witness, what did you witness, I suppose, is what I'm asking.
Yes. You witness all the highs and lows, and that's how life seems to be in Palestine. There's no just middle ground, because, life's always tough, but if nothing really awful is happening, then everybody appears to just get on with it amazingly with the sense of smooth. But the demolitions obviously are very difficult to go to. And yeah, it's amazing that they just feel that you can make a difference. I think that's what surprised me. I kind of thought that, was I just going to be some kind of onlooker at the scene? But for people to be able to tell you what's happened, for you then to be able to come back and tell other people, it does make a difference to them. And yes, awful as it is, they really do want people out there to be the witnesses and to walk alongside them. And they say, particularly as well, I think, for when you're accompanying children to school or access to worship, that things are different going through checkpoints if there are observers.
What kinds of differences?
That the Israeli military behave better, that perhaps they'll get through a bit faster. Mm-hmm. And we went on a number of occasions. I went to court with a particular family who were having difficulties, and they were just so keen to try and get internationals there because, it could almost, I don't know if it did change the verdict, but they felt that it could, because people didn't like to appear to be completely unreasonable.
Certainly some of the videos of physical abuse by IDF forces of Palestinians, I imagine, are not likely to happen if there's clearly an independent observer.
Yeah, and I think you could always, yes, certainly less likely to happen, I'm sure.
Evelyn.
Well, it was you mentioning taking the children to school. What happened? How do the Palestinians, when you're so surrounded as your family were, how do they shop? How do they trade? Do they have any connection with the settlers in a sort of bartering sort of situation?
No, I don't think they had any positive connection with the settlers, this particular family.
Where do they go shopping? Because they were
in the village in Beta Jitsa, they could get out of their own drive and go shopping.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's no, I don't, as far as I know, well, from when it's many years since I was in the West Bank, but there are shops in the settlements are not open to Palestinians, and settlers would not go to Palestinian village shops. It is a pretty well and entirely apartheid system, both on the ground and in terms of the way that the law applies to property rights and movement and so on. Bethany, oh, are you just scratching your head?
But it was a fantastic experience, and if anybody is contemplating doing something like that, it really has been amazingly worthwhile. I didn't think initially that in a company really could do very much that would be useful. But as I say, when you meet the Palestinians and you realise that you can make a difference if you're there, well, and then the only other difference you can make is when you come back and advocate. So I really hope that you'll be moved to look at some of the things that I'm going to send on, or perhaps follow the olive harvest and just, you know, talk about it some more to other people.
Will how far were you through your period when you had to come back, Sue?
I've been in Jerusalem for 12 weeks, so we had to come back 2 weeks early.
Oh, okay. So there's not yeah. So you won't be going back to do your other 2 weeks at some point. I don't.
Well, I mean, they've always had a handover, so I don't know. I'd be quite happy to go back for a bit longer. I don't know if I could do 14 weeks because, as I was saying, physically it is quite demanding. Well, where I was, it was, because you do an awful lot of walking, and there's some very steep hills. And when I was there in the winter, as you could see from the photos, apart from the sunny one when we were all standing together outside the old city, it was raining, cold, and you never really quite get dry.
The whole program suspended at the moment. Sorry.
Well, no.
Is the program suspended at the moment?
They keep on reviewing the situation, but obviously at the moment internationals can't get in. So the people in the office are still there, and they've been going out to visit some of the olive harvesting and try and keep in touch with everybody. But they can't do the same work as, you know, 20, 24 other people. They're trying to build other links.
Yeah. Do you have any contact with, or did you have any contact when you were there with some of the Jewish human rights groups? I mean, the rabbis for human rights, the Jews for justice for Palestine.
I perhaps should have said that, as well as doing the accompanying, we also had a couple of spent some time in Haifa. So in Israeli community, we went to synagogue for a service. We went and had a meal with a family, a Shabbat meal on a Friday night, and then we met them the next day at the synagogue to have some, you know, try and have a useful discussion between what we were doing there and what they thought of us being there. So this is a progressive synagogue, and that, you know, that was very interesting, and it was good to meet Israeli people too.
It's really important, I think, because we get this sort of slightly monolithic view of Jewish opinion as being sort of unilaterally fully in solidarity with the Israeli government, but it's not really the case at all, especially increasingly so, I think, in the States, which is obviously a key ally of the Israeli government.
Combatants for Peace is a really good organisation to look at. They I mean, there's a website and things, you know, that has got some very interesting information on it.
Combatants for Peace?
Yes.
Oh, so are they like ex-Israeli soldiers, IDF soldiers? Yeah. Interesting. Cherry?
So, listening to your presentation, which I have to say was really helpful and informative, I just have a sense that of real despair almost. Like, has anything changed? I mean, what we hear is that it just doesn't, the international community is not managing to make anything change, that the situation for the Palestinians seems to just get worse, that there are more settlements being built. Is there anything that's happening that is hopeful, that does seem to be improving for them?
I don't know about improving for them, but maybe within the Palestinian community themselves, you know, if Hamas actually then works with the Palestinian Authority, then that would be a step forward for them. You know, I don't know whether it has to get worse before it can get better, but there's still a lot of people trying. That's all I can say.
The international climate, on the one hand, seems to get worse with the Trump regime, you know, sort of very clearly supporting the Israeli government, but on the other hand, it could that could change around quite dramatically, especially if
actually, I've got a quote from this Jack, who is in the Jerusalem EAPPI office, and I was at a webinar with him quite recently, And he said there are three parties to this conflict: the Israelis, the Palestinians, and the international community. So, it's up to us as the EAPPI to advocate to the international community, because, to try and get things changed. That was his view. And he is the, I can't remember his title is Programme Coordinator. So that is his line, three people, and one of them is the international community. So that's really who we've just got to keep advocating to, I think. Which
okay,
is
well,
yes.
We're just coming up. Thank you ever so much, Sue, and I hope, anything that you can send on to me, I'll find a way to share it with others in our meeting.
And if anybody's got any feedback they want to give by you to me, then I'd be very happy to hear it as well, because I'm still quite at the beginning of some of these talks. So if you feel there's anything I could do better to deliver it, then I would really like to know, because that's the whole point of them. I want to deliver something that's meaningful.
I think your slide presentation was really good. I think I don't know if you've probably seen that map which shows the boundaries of the Palestinian, the West Bank and Gaza in 1948, and the way progressively it's been fragmented, so that it now consists of a scattering of green dots instead of a green block. But all the slides I found helpful.
Thank you.
Christine?
Simon, Sue's said she's going to send us things of ideas we could do to help. Could that go in the next newsletter that's about to come out, Watford Quakers?
Yeah. Let's do that. I'll when I see it, I'll forward it to Jill. And Jill's our newsletter editor.
If we can put the link to the talk as well, then other people who haven't been here today, who read about it in the newsletter, can then actually see the talk.
Yeah. Well, that, I guess the link could be in the notices for next week, Chris. Yeah.
So I just want to say there's something very powerful about hearing the story, both the history and the current experiences, from somebody who has been there and experienced it themselves. It's very useful to hear that one-to-one. It's different from in a book or on the news.
Thank you. Thanks.
Bethany, you definitely did have your hand up that time.
I did, thank you. Yeah, I just had a quick question. I don't know if Sue mentioned I was with the EAPPI program as well in the past, and I'm now doing some research on it. So I was just wondered if you, as a group of Watford Quakers, had a EA speak to you in the past, or whether this was your first presentation.
We did. It was quite a few years ago. There's a chap called Mike Barnes. And he's not a member of our meeting, but I think his mum was Quaker, and he's still around. I don't think he does well. Actually, I know he still disseminates a lot of information about Israel Palestine. Why did you want to make contact with him? I can put you in touch if you want.
No, I was just interested as to how in different Quaker groups, how much was known about the programme in general, just out of kind of curiosity, really. So whether it was completely new or something that was already fairly familiar, or
Why don't we do quick hands up? Who already knew quite a bit about the programme already? If you hands up if you already knew a fair amount about it.
Yeah.
And hands up the people for whom this is the first time they've been hearing about this.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, thank you. That's interesting. I mean, I think it's always so useful to get very recent updates and to hear from what's happening right at the moment. So I'm not, it was just curious as to how many EAs have been involved in different groups that we're speaking to. Thanks. Yeah.
Cherry.
I think in part how this came about was because we had a speaker on the Holocaust program and that is being presented to young children in schools, which was extremely interesting. But of course, it then moved on to, well, and how about what's happening in Palestine now to other people, and we weren't able to explore that at the time, and we certainly, I mean certainly I think a lot of us were left with a feeling that out of that appalling situation, we are now in another one of such gross human rights.
Yeah. Thanks, Jerry. Well, on that note, I think we should, because it's just gone 2 o'clock. But just like to thank you again, Sue, very much for joining us, and good luck with your future disseminations. Is that the word? That'll do.
No, well, thank you very much again. It's been very nice to meet you all and to have the opportunity to tell you about some of the things I did. Thank you again. Okay.
Thanks. Shall we just end with just a brief moment of quiet?